History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 7, The End of the Europeans' World. Chapter 5, The Second World War. The Japanese decision was also a rash one. Though the logic of Japanese policy had long pointed towards conflict with the United States, Japan's ties with Germany and Italy, though they had some propaganda value for both sides, did not amount to much in practice. What mattered in the timing of Japanese policy was the resolution of debates in Tokyo about the danger or lack of it of a challenge to the United States which must involve war. The crux of the matter was that Japan's needs for a successful conclusion of the war in China included oil which she could only obtain with the tacit consent of the United States that Japan was to destroy China. This no American government could have given. Instead, in October 1941, the American government imposed an embargo on all trade by United States citizens with Japan. There followed the last stages of a process which had its origins in the ascendancy established in Japan by reactionary and militant forces in the 1930s. The question had by this time become for the Japanese military planners purely strategic and technical, since they would have to take the resources in Southeast Asia which they needed by force. All that had to be settled was the nature of the war against the United States and its timing. Such a decision was fundamentally irrational, for the chances of ultimate success were only very small. Once arguments of national honor had won, though the final calculations about the best point and the moment of attack were carefully made. The choice was made to strike as hard a blow as possible against American sea power at the outset in order to gain the maximum freedom of movement in the Pacific and South China Sea. The result was the onslaught of 7th December, whose centerpiece was an air attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, which was one of the most brilliantly conceived and executed operations in the history of warfare. Yet, it fell just short of complete success, for it did not destroy American naval air power, though it gave the Japanese for months the strategical freedom they sought. After their victory at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese faced a prolonged war they were bound to lose in the end. They had united Americans. Isolationism could be virtually ignored after 8th December. Roosevelt had a nation behind him as Winston never had. When a few Japanese bombs had even fallen on the American mainland, it was obvious that this was much more truly a world war than the first had been. The German operations in the Balkans had, by the time of Pearl Harbor, left continental Europe with only 4 neutral countries: Spain, Portugal, Sweden, and Switzerland. The war in North Africa raged back and forth between Libya and Egypt. It extended to Syria by the arrival there of a German mission, and to Iraq when a nationalist government supported by German aircraft was removed by a British force. Iran had been occupied by British and Soviet forces in 1941. In Africa, Ethiopia was liberated and the Italian colonial empire destroyed. With the opening of the Far Eastern War, the Japanese wrought destruction on the colonial empires there too. Within a few months, they took Indonesia, Indochina, Malaya, and the Philippines. They pressed through Burma towards the Indian border and were soon bombing the North Australian port of Darwin from New Guinea. Meanwhile, the naval war was fought by German submarine forces, aircraft and surface raiders all over the Atlantic, Arctic, Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean. Only a tiny minority of countries were left outside this struggle. Its demands were colossal and carried much further the mobilization of whole societies than had the First World War. The role of the United States was decisive. Her huge manufacturing power made the material preponderance of the United Nations as the coalition of states fighting the Germans, the Italians, and Japanese was called from the beginning of 1942 incontestable. Nonetheless, the way ahead was still a hard one. The first half of 1942 was a very bleak time for the United Nations. Then came the turning point in four great and very different battles. In June, a Japanese fleet attacking Midway Island was broken in a battle fought largely by aircraft. Japanese losses in carriers and air crews were such that she never regained the strategical initiative, and the long American counterattack in the Pacific now began to unroll. Then, at the beginning of November, the British Army in Egypt decisively defeated the Germans and Italians and began a march west, which was to end with the eviction of the enemy from all North Africa. The Battle of El Alamein had coincided with landings by Anglo-American forces in French North Africa. They subsequently moved eastwards, and by May 1943, German and Italian resistance on the continent had ceased. 6 months earlier, at the end of 1942, the Russians had bottled up at Stalingrad on the Volga of a German army rashly exposed by Hitler. The remnants surrendered in February in the most demoralizing defeat yet suffered by the Germans in Russia, and yet one which was only part of the 3 splendid months of winter advance which marked the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. The other great Allied victory had no specific date, but was an important one as any one of these. This was the Battle of the Atlantic. Allied merchant shipping losses reached their peak in 1942. At the end of the year, nearly 8 million tons of shipping had been lost for 87 U-boats sunk. In 1943, the figures were 3.25 million tons and 237 U-boats, and during the spring months, the battle had been won. In May alone, 47 U-boats had been sunk. This was the most crucial of all the United Nations, for on it depended their ability to draw on American production. Command of the sea also made possible re-entry to Europe. Roosevelt had agreed to give priority to the defeat of Germany, but the mounting of an invasion of France to take the strain off the Russian armies could not in the end be managed before 1944, and this angered Stalin. When it came, the Anglo-American invasion of northern France in June 1944 was the greatest seaborne expedition in history. Mussolini had by then been overthrown by the Italians, and Italy had already been invaded from the south. Now, Germany was fighting on 3 fronts. Soon after the landings in Normandy, the Russians entered Poland. Going faster than their allies, it still took them until next April to reach Berlin. In the west, Allied forces had by then broken out of Italy into Central Europe and from the Low Countries into northern Germany. Almost incidentally, terrible destruction had been inflicted on German cities by a great air offensive which, until the last few months of the war, exercised no decisive strategic effect. When on 30th April, the man who had ignited this conflagration killed himself in a bunker in the ruins of Berlin, historic Europe was literally as well as figuratively in ruins. The war in the Far East took a little longer. At the beginning of August 1945, the Japanese government knew it must be defeated. Many of Japan's former conquests had been retrieved. Her cities were devastated by American bombing, and her sea power, on which communications and safety from invasion rested, was in ruins. At this moment, 2 nuclear weapons of destructive powers hitherto unapproached were dropped with terrible effect on 2 Chinese cities by the Americans. Between the explosions, the Russians declared war on Japan. On 2nd September, the Japanese government abandoned its plan of a suicidal last-ditch stand and signed an instrument of surrender. The Second World War had come to an end. In its immediate aftermath, it was difficult to measure the colossal extent of what had happened. Only one clear and unambiguous good was at once visible: the overthrow of the Nazi regime. As the Allied armies advanced into Europe, the deepest evils of a system of terror and torture were revealed by the opening of huge prison camps and the revelations of what went on in them. It was suddenly apparent that Churchill had spoken no more than the bare truth when he told his countrymen that if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science. The reality of this threat could first be seen in the Belsen and Buchenwald. Distinctions could hardly be meaningful between degrees of atrocity inflicted on political prisoners, slave laborers from other countries, or some prisoners of war. But the world's imagination was most struck by the belated recognition of the systematic attempt which had been made to wipe out European Jewry. The so-called final solution sought by Germans, an attempt which was carried far enough to change the demographic map. The Polish Jews were almost obliterated, and Dutch Jews too suffered terribly in proportion to their numbers. Overall, though complete figures may never be available, it is probable that between 5 and 6 million Jews were killed, whether in the gas chambers and crematoria of the extermination camps, by shooting and extermination on the spot in East and Southeast Europe, or by overwork and hunger. Few people and no nations had engaged in the war because they saw it as a struggle against such wickedness. It cannot be doubted, though, that many of them were heartened as it proceeded by the sense that the conflict had a moral dimension. Propaganda contributed to this. Even while England was the only nation in Europe still on her feet and fighting for her survival, a democratic society had sought to see in the struggle positive ends which went beyond survival and beyond the destruction of Nazism. Aspirations to a new world of cooperation between great powers and social and economic reconstruction were embodied in the Atlantic Charter and the United Nations. They were encouraged by sentimental goodwill towards allies and a tragic blurring of differences of interest and social ideals, which were only too quickly to re-emerge. Much wartime rhetoric boomeranged badly with the coming of peace. Disillusionment followed inspection of the world after the guns were silent. Yet, for all this, the war of 1939 to 1945 in Europe remains a moral struggle in a way, perhaps in which no other war between great powers has ever been. It is important to remember this. Too much was to be heard of the regrettable consequences of Allied forces, and it is too easily forgotten that it crushed the worst challenge to liberal civilization that ever has arisen. Some far-sighted men could see a deep irony in this. In many ways, Germany had been one of the most progressive countries in Europe, the embodiment of much that was best in its civilization. That Germany should fall prey to collective derangement on this scale suggested that something had been wrong at the root of that civilization itself. The crimes of Nazism had been carried out not in a fit of barbaric intoxication with conquest, but in a systematic, scientific, controlled, bureaucratic, though often inefficient way, about which there was little that was irrational except the appalling end which it sought. In this respect, the Asian War was importantly different. Japanese imperialism replaced the old Western imperialisms for a time, but many among the subject peoples did not much regret the change. Propaganda during the war attempted to give currency to the notion of a fascist Japan, but this was a distortion of so traditional a society's character. No such appalling consequences as faced European nations under German rule would have followed from a Japanese victory. The second obvious result of the war was its unparalleled destructiveness. It was most visible in the devastated cities of Germany and Japan, where mass aerial bombing, one of the major innovations of Second World War, proved much more costly to life and buildings than had been the bombing of Spanish cities in the Spanish Civil War. Yet even those early essays had been enough to convince many observers that bombing alone could bring a country to its knees. In fact, although often invaluable in combination with other forms of fighting, the huge strategic bombing offensive against Germany, built up by the British Royal Air Force from tiny beginnings in 1940 and steadily supplemented by the United States Air Force from 1942 onwards, up to the point at which their combined forces could provide a target with continuous day and night bombing, achieved very little until the last few months of the war. Nor was the fiery destruction of the Japanese cities strategically so important as the elimination of its sea power. Not only cities had been shattered, the economic life and communications of Central Europe had also been grievously stricken. In 1945, millions of refugees were wandering about in it, trying to get home. There was a grave danger of famine and epidemic because of the difficulty of supplying food. The tremendous problems of 1918 were upon Europe again, and this time confronted nations demoralized by defeat and occupation. Only the neutrals and Great Britain had escaped those scourges. These were abundant arms in private hands, and some feared revolution. These conditions could be found in Asia, but there the physical destruction was less severe and the prospects of recovery better. In Europe too, the revolutionary political impact of the war was obvious. The power structure, which had been a reality until 1914 and had an illusionary prolongation of life between the two world wars, was doomed in 1941. Two great peripheral powers dominated Europe politically and were established militarily in its heart. This was evident at a meeting of the Allied leaders at Yalta in February 1945, at which Roosevelt secretly agreed with Stalin on the terms on which the USSR would enter the war against Japan. Yalta also provided a basis for agreement between all three great powers, which was to be the nearest thing to a formal peace settlement for Europe achieved for decades. Its outcome was that the old Central Europe would disappear. Europe would be divided into Eastern and Western halves. Once again, a Trieste-Baltic line became a reality, but now new differences were to be layered on top of old. At the end of 1945, there lay to the east a Europe of states which, with the exception of Greece, all had communist governments and governments in which communists shared powers with others. The Russian army, which had overrun them, had proved itself a far better instrument for the extension of international communism than revolution had ever been. The pre-war Baltic republics did not emerge from the Soviet state, of course, and the Soviet Union now also absorbed parts of pre-war Poland and Romania. Germany, the center of the old European power structure, had effectively ceased to exist. A phase of European history which he had dominated was at an end, and Bismarck's creation was partitioned into zones occupied by the Russians, Americans, British, and French. The other major political units of Western Europe had reconstituted themselves after occupation and defeat. but were feeble. Italy, which had changed sides after Mussolini had been overthrown, had, like France, a much strengthened and enlarged Communist Party which, it could not be forgotten, was still committed to the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. Only Great Britain retained its stature of 1939 in the world's eyes. It was even briefly enhanced by its stand in 1940 and 1941 and remained for a while the recognized equal of Russia and the United States. Formally, this was true of France and China too, but less attention was paid to them. Yet, Great Britain's moment was past. By a huge effort of mobilizing its resources and the social life to a degree unequaled outside Stalin's Russia, the country had been able to retain its standing. But it had been let out of a strategic impasse only by the German attack on Russia and kept afloat by American Lend-Lease. And this aid had not been without its costs. The Americans had insisted on the sale of British overseas assets to meet the bills before it was forthcoming. Moreover, the sterling area was dislocated. American capital was now to move into the old dominions on a large scale. Those countries had learnt new lessons, both from their new wartime strength and, paradoxically, from their weakness in so far as they had relied upon the mother country for their defense. From 1945, they more and more acted with full as well as formal independence. It only took a few years for this huge change in the position of the greatest of the old imperial powers to become clear. Symbolically, when Great Britain made its last great military effort in Europe in 1944, the expedition was commanded by an American general. Though British forces in Europe for a few months afterwards matched the Americans, they were by the end of the wartime outnumbered. In the Far East too, although the British reconquered Burma, the defeat of Japan was the work of the American naval and air power. For all Churchill's efforts, Roosevelt was by the end of the war negotiating over his head with Stalin, proposing inter alia the dismantling of the British Empire. Great Britain, in spite of its victorious stand alone in 1940 and the moral prestige this gave, had not escaped the shattering impact of war on Europe's political structure. Indeed, it was in some ways the power with which Germany illustrated its best. Thus was registered in Europe the passing of the European supremacy, also evident at its periphery. In the last and only briefly successful attempt by a British government to thwart American policy, British forces secured Dutch and French territories in Asia just in time to hand them back to their former overlords and prevent the seizure of power by anti-colonial regimes. But fighting with rebels began almost immediately, and it was clear that the imperial powers faced a difficult future. The war had brought revolution to the empires too. Subtly and suddenly, the kaleidoscope of authority had shifted, and it was still shifting as the war came to an end. The year 1945 is not, therefore, a good place at which to pause. Reality was then still masked somewhat by appearance. Many Europeans still had to discover painfully that the European age of empire was over.